Welcome to Healthcare du Jour, where we dish up and digest the latest in healthcare. For the next 30 minutes, sit back as we bring you insight, commentary, and discussion on trending topics to the table, all expertly served up by our host and his guests. Healthcare du Jour is brought to you by High Tech Answers and Healthcare Now Radio, part of the Answers Media Network, and is sponsored by the law offices of Myrick O'Connell. Now here is your host, Matt Fisher.
Well, welcome back and thank you for joining as we dive into the hottest topics in healthcare. I'm your host, Matt Fisher. On the menu today are Justin and Bob from Galen Healthcare. Guys, can you introduce yourselves to everybody?
Sure. I'm Bob Downey. I'm the Vice President of Product Development at Galen, so I'm in charge of essentially all of our technology solutions and products.
And I'm Justin Campbell. I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Strategy at Galen. I'm responsible for competitive intelligence and synthesis of service offerings.
So maybe a little bit of background as well in terms of what Galen does. I think it's certainly becoming a more widely known name, but I'll give you guys the opportunity to give the elevator pitch in terms of who you are and what the company does.
Sure, absolutely. I can start there. So we are a boutique healthcare information technology focused consultancy. We also offer product solutions. Our company is comprised of 3 separate divisions: our technical services team, our professional services team, and of course our products division. We were recently ranked #1 in class for technical services as well as professional services. We deliver a suite of fully integrated products. Those include eCalcs for the Allscripts consumer base, and also Vital Center, which is a business continuity solution. Our latest offering is an archival solution that's vendor agnostic, and we're seeing a lot of demand for that particular product. So we've been around for 11 years now, and we've served over 300 clients ranging from HIEs to smaller physician offices to large integrated delivery networks. And specifically our expertise is in data migration and archival. We've done up to 250 data migration and archival projects, so we've got a lot of experience with regard to that area.
When you're looking at a migration project, what are the biggest challenges that you'll see, or maybe what are the most common challenges that you'll see?
Sure, that's a great question, Matt. And actually, we sponsored a transition panel that touched on this just recently, where a few of our clients spoke on that. So I encourage folks to check that out. But as there were some salient points that they brought up, issues they encountered in their own projects. But certainly, whenever you're forklifting data from one system to another, inherently there's underlying issues with the mapping and the nomenclature harmonization of those nomenclatures and dictionaries, right? In the source system, how the data is stored and the nature of that data can be completely different than the target system. So it's our job to navigate our clients through that transition of migrating the data. Of course, all of those providers worked very hard to capture that data electronically in their source system, and certainly they don't want to leave that data behind. That plays well into archival as well, because often an issue clients will face is, well, how much of the data do I take over? How much of it do I need? And what do I do with the data I don't bring over from a compliance perspective, from a legal perspective? And so that's where we scope out, okay, what clinical elements are maybe important to your specialty or your organization, and decide what subset of that data is going to be migrated to the new system and what subset of that data might be archived.
Right. So when you're thinking about the archiving, what are some of the primary challenges there? I guess maybe let's pick on the technical pieces of it first, because you talked about legal and regulatory issues too, and certainly I want to move over into that direction as we move down the archival path.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So I mean, archival to a large extent, if you're doing a migration especially, and that means that you're somewhat covered from a clinical continuity perspective. Archival is really about risk mitigation. That you have to choose your mechanisms for archival essentially as a cost-benefit analysis between what's the risk that I'm going to need that data and I don't have it, versus what are the costs for actually preserving all of that data, as well as taking into account things like, well, if I simply store everything, does that increase the cost of discovering the data in the time frames allowed for certain things like e-discovery scenarios? So if I've got mountains and mountains of data and I have to manually sift through that to produce information as a result of an e-discovery request, is that feasible from a timeline point of view if I've kept everything? So that really rests on top of whether or not the platform you're choosing to preserve that data makes it easily accessible. And so to give you an example, up until probably the last 2 or 3 years as the archival market has started to mature, it was a completely reasonable strategy to simply take database backups and storage backups of all of those legacy systems whenever they are available and dump them somewhere, dump them on long-term storage. And that is the only way that that's a real feasible solution generally is if you're counting on the fact that you're not going to need it. You're doing it to sort of dot your I's and cross your T's from the letter of the law point of view, but you're really hoping that there's no actual process that you have to go through to retrieve it, because if you do, you're going to be in for a world of hurt, because that's not a trivial thing to do, to access that data from kind of the raw data files that you've backed up. So what we advise customers to do in terms of a process they go through, part of it is understanding what's most likely to be needed, and then part of it's understanding that you really do need to preserve everything, and it's striking the balance between accessibility, cost, and risk mitigation. That's really what it comes down to.
Right. So, maybe to help people, and me included, who aren't necessarily fully technically inclined, can you maybe walk through what an archival system would look like and how you would structure it then?
Sure. I mean, I can walk through sort of the ideal archival system and maybe give you an example of a less than ideal archival system. So in an ideal world, you're preserving everything, but you're making a subset of that information easily accessible to potentially clinicians and certainly to HIM and legal folks. And so there's a bunch of steps that are involved in that are non-trivial from a technical point of view. First, you need to preserve the data from those source EMRs, practice management systems, even sometimes HR and ancillary systems, in a way that is as close to the original format as possible. So that's kind of table stakes. One of the things that's inherent with data migrations of all types is that you're changing the data as part of that migration. So if I'm moving data from EMR1 to EMR2, the way they store that data, the shape of that data, everything about that data is potentially different. And that's an accepted risk, and that's one of the reasons that migrations are technically advanced and time-consuming, is because they have to take all that into account. From an archival point of view, that's dangerous, because if I go in and, to give you an example of a less than ideal archival scenario, I just create a snapshot of a chart, make it into a document like a PDF, which is pretty common. That is basically a data migration, right? I'm taking information from an EMR, I'm choosing what to show and what not to show. I'm potentially losing information if that EMR goes away after I've produced this kind of snapshot of the chart.
Right.
And you're basically taking that risk. You're saying, this is likely what I'm going to need. I'm going to hope I don't need anything that I didn't choose to include in the PDF. And then I'm going to store that someplace that I can reasonably easily search it and retrieve it. Whereas the ideal archival solution would allow you to preserve all of that raw data while also surfacing it in a way that's more like a PDF, in the way that you can easily search it, filter it, and use it from a clinical or legal perspective.
When you're going through that archiving process, then understanding, I think, as you said, you're changing to some degree the system that you're using. Are you just taking raw data from the original system and then transforming it so you can use it in whatever new system you have, or do you have to have some type of legacy access to the prior system?
Yeah, so the goal will be that you never have to have legacy access, because oftentimes that's just not financially feasible. Those systems are expensive to keep running. So the way that we approach it is we'll take a reasonably raw copy. So there's actually intellectual property concerns if you're just taking a copy of the database. That's typically considered property, intellectual property of those EMR vendors, and usually their contracts specifically say, if you cease to use our software and you are terminating your license, that database is not your property.
Right.
Whether the data is your property is a whole other question, but the database itself is not your property because there's code in there, there's business logic. So what we generally do is we'll take the contents of the data, contents of the database, move it to a more neutral storage format without changing it in any significant way. And then on top of that, we layer our archival solution, which basically surfaces that information out of the kind of raw view into something that's usable from a product point of view. Because you need to be able to, for instance, if I'm showing you in an archive problems and allergies and meds and vitals, we have to know where that came from, how we're supposed to display it, what it means. There's context there that's valuable. And you're not going to get that certainly in a scalable way just from the raw data. So we have a process internally that takes that and surfaces it in as generic a way, but as clinically specific a way as possible, which is kind of conflicting. And that's the way that we approach it, because we don't want to take the risk that as part of our archival process, we miss something. We never want to have a scenario where we didn't bring over a data element because our data model didn't support it.
Right.
And so we don't do that. We take a blended or a hybrid approach.
So, I'd like to hit on one of the items you just said, which is, the proprietary nature of, maybe the database format, and then, the open question of data ownership. Or, what trends are you seeing in that direction? And I'm wondering if, there's maybe a breaking point, given that, was it ONC just came out with the EMR contracting guidance, seeing how that might have an impact.
So I can tell you what we encounter, and it varies pretty dramatically. Essentially, every EMR customer assumes they own the data, and every EMR vendor doesn't necessarily assume that. And most of the times, I would say, this is not an exact figure, but I'd say 80 to 90% of the time we don't have a problem obtaining the data for the customer as part of an archival or a migration process. The vendor, if they don't provide us direct access, which is the ideal way to do it, they'll at a minimum provide us some kind of export of that information. So we're not getting the database, the IP, but we're getting most if not all of the raw data. And they're doing that probably to some extent because most BAAs at least over the past couple of years, most BAAs have some kind of clause in them related to data ownership, and specifically related to what happens when you terminate the relationship with that business associate, what happens with the data that they're working with. And generally those BAAs say, we have to either return the data or verify with you that we've destroyed it, or that we'll be responsible for handling things like information disclosure in a compliant way. And the interpretation they'll mostly take is, okay, we'll just give you the data back and wash our hands of it so that we don't have to get into any kind of legal conflict with you. That's most of the time, not all of the time, but that's most of the time.
So when that data is being given back, though, who's choosing the format in which it comes back in?
So most of the time we're getting the databases. We're getting either a raw dump of the data in the databases or something close to it, close enough. But especially with hosted vendors, I won't mention names, but there's a lot of vendors out there that have trended towards being a hosted solution because it allows them to add additional fees and services and management, and there's operational efficiencies they get from that, obviously, and that's the trend of the industry in general, I'd say. In those cases, it's plausible they're not going to give you direct access or give you a copy of the database, and so they're the ones who are choosing the format, and that can be very problematic because almost always that format takes the shape of something semi-standardized, like they might give you a CCD or something, or they might give you a list in their chosen format of problems, allergies, meds, something that they consider a relevant subset, and almost always that's missing information you need to archive. It's missing audit trails, which is a big problem. It's missing potentially how data changed over time, so version histories. Then it's missing fields that you might not show to end users, but could be relevant in certain legal scenarios that show you, for instance, that an alert was displayed on a patient's chart for some reason. That might not be immediately obvious from a data export that doesn't include all of that relevant, business object data that's stored in the database. So that's why we like direct access to the data whenever we can.
Right, and when you're talking about direct access, you mean you can go in and then be able to pull and extract everything that
Yes.
you want and basically say, okay, after this period of time, we don't need to go in there anymore because we've pulled everything that you need?
Yeah, I mean, the archival or migration process is iterative, so we'll generally do test extracts and then big extracts for the bulk of it, and then do gap loads, and there's a long, lengthy process. But you're right, and eventually the end game is if we have continuous access to the original databases, we'll eventually iterate to the point where we know we've got what we need, and then they can shut down the systems and get rid of them. So yeah,
Right.
correct.
So when you're working in that direction, are you seeing that your clients have contracts that appropriately cover these issues, or are you having to try and negotiate it at the end of the day?
So surprisingly enough, most vendors, even though you've probably already terminated your contract with them and you're essentially sunsetting at some date, so they've got very little reason to keep you happy, most vendors will still give you direct access. Now, granted, a good chunk of our customers run their own EMR infrastructure, so they have IT staff that's running the databases, and so there's no roadblock to granting us direct access. It's really, again, only the hosted vendors that can make life a little bit difficult, but even in those cases, we're generally seeing the ability to directly connect, not always, and as I said, there are certain vendors that are more problematic than others, but the contracts very rarely lay out the technical details of how they provide access, and that's something I would definitely recommend everybody do, is anytime they're signing a contract with somebody who's going to have your data and it's not physically running on your machines, which is more and more common for a lot of good reasons, there should be very specific details about how the data is provided, what the fidelity of that data is, what the timeliness of the data is, and for what period of time after, or having some kind of window in which you're going to have access to those dumps of data. And very few contracts that we've seen, at least, have that. They're relying on the vendors not trying to be difficult and
Right.
just giving you access to the data. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. It's, you want to try and have as much detail as you can within the contract to cover all eventualities. I think what seems to be, the common rule of thumb is, especially with the first step, when people are obtaining their EMRs was, this is great, this is going to last forever, we're not going to have to worry about going somewhere else. And they weren't thinking about these issues, whereas now it seems like there is greater awareness because you're starting to see more frequent migrations or changes from one system to another.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, this has only been a problem for the last 5 years, if that. So, yeah.
So, and then actually, kind of given that, background statement, are you working with clients who are on, migration number 2 or beyond?
I don't, Justin, do you know if we've ever
done?
Yeah,
I think we've encountered a couple cases, maybe 1 or 2 cases, and you mostly see that with acquisitions, not necessarily in organizations that's decided to jump ship twice, but maybe that group has been acquired. Maybe they made their own switch earlier on, and now they've been acquired and need to move to the enterprise standard. But to your point on this, Matt, regarding the replacement market, people desire that the seamlessness between care settings, right, to deliver that data. And when you inherently have 2 different databases, certainly an Epic or a Cerner is going to be better positioned than, and just picking examples, but an Allscripts or a NextGen environment where you need some middleware in between to harmonize that data.
Yeah. Right. So, maybe, taking that example, Justin, where you said that, maybe more frequently you're seeing that it's not the one particular client that's choosing to change multiple times, but it's, maybe they changed and now they're going through an acquisition, so they're having to change as a result of that acquisition. Do you see better terms for access to an extraction of data for people who've gone through the process a second time?
Not necessarily, to be honest with you. I think, these groups sometimes take the contract as is and maybe don't dig their claws into it to push back on some items. And to be frank with you, if you look back, a couple of years ago, did they know the things that they should have been asking for? It could be argued that they didn't. But certainly the people now who are approaching us for data migration, they're taking it into consideration. You know, those groups who maybe have waited, the Meditech base is a good example of that, where they've been sort of standing pat on the Magic version, not necessarily moving to the new 6.x, maybe due to cost issues, and not moving to Epic or Cerner. We're finding that now they're better armed with information so they can push back on those contracts.
It's interesting. Hopefully that market will continue to mature, and you'll have, you know, the provider side better understanding what rights they should be seeking and or obligations they should be imposing in the agreements. I want to kind of take a step back on the archiving, and maybe this is, you know, going too far back on that question, but when you're doing these migrations, are you still having to deal with any you know, paper records that have been archived, or, you know, kind of where does paper still fall into it? Because you know, I know some of my clients still have warehouses full of paper.
So some of that will depend on how long ago they migrated to their first EMR. And what state they're in and a bunch of things like that, right? Because whether or not they need to preserve those paper records at all depends on how old they are, what state they're in, the patients themselves, all of the rules that go into this cacophony. I'm not even sure if that's the right word. There's probably some other words you could use to describe that situation. So at this point, we're far enough along that most groups either already move those paper records and scan them into a previous EMR, in which case they're migrated along with everything else, just as another document, or they're just old enough that it's generally not part of their archival strategy. That said, a lot of archival products and solutions out there do have some kind of facility to include and scan in paper information, but a lot of groups are also just perfectly happy keeping them in boxes, you know, somewhere in their storage units as they have previously, because it's not, I mean, they've got a system in place already for handling requests for records that are that old, and they don't see it worth the pretty significant cost to actually put those into a, you know, have manual labor to scan those in, categorize them, index them, add metadata. It's a lot of work. So most groups we've encountered, either they've already paid that penalty or they're not going to pay that penalty because they either don't need to or they don't want to.
Yeah, no, and that is, I think, still definitely a very real concern. It's, you know, my wife is a physician and she has stacks of records in her office that she got from, you know, incoming new patients, and it's, you know, trying to find the time to go through it to identify what needs to be added into her EMR because she didn't get information from prior providers in an electronic format.
Right.
And so, you know, I think we've hit a lot on archiving, and, you know, I think that's obviously led into legacy data to a little degree. You know, do you have any type of a rule of thumb of how much legacy data you're looking to retain, or, you know, are those standards kind of still developing?
So that question is definitely one that comes up a lot during migrations in terms of what we're going to bring over from a clinical continuity point of view. 2 years is a decent rule of thumb from a clinical relevancy point of view, but from a legal relevancy point of view, we keep 100% of everything that was in the chart going back forever, and that's where the tooling has to be very good to make sure you can easily search and filter and query it in a way that's not onerous. So yeah, we keep, you know, if a patient's been coming to our practice for 15 years and that's in the chart, we keep all 15 years of that. The only things that we ever get rid of are things that we can legally get rid of in terms of, let's say that the last time they were even seen was a decade ago. The last activity on their chart was a decade ago. If you're lucky enough to live in a state that 10 years would be the letter of the law, then you're good. Generally, the states, state by state, as you probably know, state by state, it's more or less the expiration on liability, like how long an organization can be held liable, whatever that statute of limitations is. That's generally where courts have come down on in terms of how long you have to keep the data. But then you have to take into account, you know, whether or not it's a managed contract, and through Medicare you have to keep it longer. Acute often has to be kept longer. Some states you have to keep it forever. So all that stuff goes into the rules. Yep.
Yeah, no, the type of provider definitely has an impact. You know, it seems like you know, more typically you'll see hospitals have to maintain records for a much longer stated period of time than a physician practice would need to.
Yep.
But, you know, as we're, I can't believe we're already starting to get towards the end of our time together, maybe Maybe the last kind of question I'd like to throw out to you is, if a practice or an organization is thinking about transitioning or doing a migration, what should they do to prepare to help ease that transition and make it, you know, a smoother process overall?
Catalog everything as much as you possibly can. So know what systems have PHI, know how old the systems are, whether or not they're relevant anymore from a legal perspective. Have a big catalog of that you can provide to a third-party vendor to help you then archive it, because we can only archive what we know exists, and you'd be shocked how often we're most of the way through an archival project and they discover a half a dozen other systems that need to be archived all on the same timeline as the original contract. So that would be my biggest recommendation, is to make sure you know what you have.
And then from a migration perspective, certainly there's so many mapping considerations that go into it. Workflow considerations, how's the workflow going to work in the new system with this particular clinical item? So we often find that clients underestimate the scope of that assessment and don't engage it early enough in the process, right? They sort of push and wait for the data migration assessment to occur.
Yeah, well, believe it or not, we're out of time. I want to thank my guests, Bob Downey and Justin Campbell, for a great conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you to everyone for listening. Keep the dialogue going and connect with me at #HCDEJURE. I'm Matt Fisher. Until next time.